everyone, and welcome to our Basic Layouts and Compose Code Along. I'm Simona, Developer Relations Engineer in the Android team.
Hi, I'm Yolanda, and I'm also a Developer Relations Engineer. In this session, we'll walk you through the basic layouts in Compose CodeLab, and you can code along with us.
So, as Yolanda is coding, feel free to open up Android Studio and follow along, or you can just watch and do the code lab yourself at a later stage. Don't forget to pause the video when needed to complete a step.
Throughout this session, I'll be sharing my screen so you can easily follow along. As you can see, it's currently showing the code lab. To find this code lab, click the link in the description of this video, or Google for basic layouts in Compose CodeLab.
During this session, we'll be implementing a real-world design of an app called MySooth. This wellness app shows various ways to improve your mental and physical well-being. By implementing the design you see here, you learn about modifiers, alignments, arrangements, lazy layouts, slot APIs, and material components. These terms might sound unfamiliar now, but by the end of this session, you'll be able to use them to create stunning UIs with Compose. Before we start, make sure you complete the Basics in Compose Code Lab, as we'll use this knowledge from that Code Lab as a basis for this one.
And so this code lab provides us with some basic code that we can use to get set up. And I already, of course, downloaded this starter code, and we will be using that while we're coding. But if you need it as well, you can either get it from GitHub or you can download the zip files from the code lab itself. So let's go to Android Studio and take a look at how that would look for us.
As you can see, our source code contains various theming files and a main activity. The resources directory shows all the different drawables and fonts that we'll use. Let's open up main activity. It contains a list of composables with empty bodies that we're going to implement. In addition, it contains some data and a preview for each composable. These previews currently don't show anything yet as we haven't implemented the composables, but as we start implementing them one by one, our previews will show us how we're doing.
So now that we've inspected this starter code in the main activity, let's go back to our code lab and let's take a further look at what we actually want to implement. So we're going to go to the next step, and in there we're going to see our design again, and we're going to try to divide this up. And this is generally a best practice. If you have a big design to implement, it might seem a little bit overwhelming, but what we can do is we can try to break it up into smaller pieces. So in this case, on our highest level, we can talk about a screen content, which contains all the content that we're showing, and then next to that, there's a bottom navigation as well. And then the screen content itself can be further divided up into a search bar, into a section that we call Align Your Body, and another section that we call Favorite Collections. And within these sections, we also see some other reusable components. So we see this little Align Your Body element, and then we see the Favorite Collection card. And with those, we have a full analysis of the elements that we want to build. And what we'll be doing is we'll start at that lowest level, creating those low-level composables, and then step by step start to combine those into bigger composables so that we eventually end up with our final design.
So first of all, let's try to implement the search bar. As you can see in the design, the search bar has a leading icon, it has some placeholder text, and it has a white background. And as you can see, we also have some additional designs here. These are called redline designs. They give us a bit more information about the design, such as certain sizes and properties. They also show an 8-pixel grid, which helps us place our composables in the right way.
So for our search bar, how are we going to implement this? Well, let's go to Android Studio and let's start with a very basic implementation. And on the highest level, our search bar is actually an editable text field. And in Compose, we call that a text field. And the text field is a material component that we can use that will give us all that functionality of editing the text in place and adding errors or whatever we want to them. So we'll start with a basic text field. And for now, we'll just use an empty string as the value and an empty lambda as the onValueChange callback. The reason for that is that this is a layout code lab. So we want to teach you how to implement designs, and we're not going to teach you about state. There's a really, really good other workshop that you can follow that teaches you more about state in Compose. So with this text field, just a very basic implementation, we can take a look at our preview and see how that will turn out.
Now, this preview doesn't really look like we want it to. It has the wrong color. The leading icon is missing, there's no placeholder text in here. So also, I think the size is not according to the designs. So to adapt this composable to fit the designs, we can actually set certain parameters of the text field composable and apply some modifiers to it. With composables, you can actually use the modifiers to either change the composable size or layout or behavior or appearance. You can also add some information like accessibility labels. You can process user input, and you can also add some high-level interactions like making an element clickable, zoomable, draggable, and much more. Each composable that you call has a modifier parameter that you can use to adapt the composable's look, feel, and behavior. When you set the modifier, you can actually chain multiple modifiers to create a more complex adaptation. So Yolanda, you can see that our composable also gets a modifier as input. And can you forward that modifier to the text field maybe?
Yeah, so the text field itself also has this modifier parameter that we can set. And in this case, we can just forward the modifier that we got as input to our search bar.
Great. Now we want our composable to be 56 dp high. We can chain our text field modifier and add height in modifier to it.
Yeah, we can. So with the height in modifier, we can set a minimum height. And in our case, we want to set a minimum height instead of a fixed height. So the alternative, what we could do is to just use the height modifier directly and set a specific height. But what we want to do is we want to use this minimum height. And the reason for that is with the minimum height, we can actually allow this composable to grow a little bit bigger. And the reason for allowing that is that, it is possible for users to choose a bigger font in their system settings, which will increase the font size throughout all of their apps. So in order to support that behavior, when we make this composable, when we give it a minimum size, we make sure that if that font size grows, then this composable will grow with it. One more thing that you might have noticed when we added this and forwarded this modifier is that there's now a little bit of spacing around our text field, which wasn't there before. And the reason for that, we can look at the preview and where we call this search bar, is that we already, from the outside in, we pass this padding modifier. And this is the strength of making sure that you pass modifiers into composables, is that you can always, from the outside in, change the look and feel of those modifiers.
So I think now for the width, we actually wanted the composable to fill the whole width of the screen. And we can use the fill max width modifier for that.
Yeah, the fill max width modifier is the one we need. And as you can see, it has a default value of 1. And we could also make it fill half of the screen by setting this to 0.5 or 75%. But in this case, the default value is exactly what we need. So how far does that bring us? We have the size set, but I think we're still missing some elements, right?
Yeah, we do. We can take a look at the preview to make sure that.
Yep.
Yeah, great.
The size is
cool.
correct.
So I think now our size is correct, but we don't really have an icon or a placeholder in our search bar. So to fix this, we can actually use the parameters of the text field. So first, let's add a leading icon.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly open up the actual text field definition in Compose. So that's a beautiful thing about Compose. You can actually open up all the definitions of the source code, and then you can see how that behaves. In our case, we can see, for example, this leading icon that you just mentioned. So let me add that as a parameter to our text fields. The leading icon, and the leading icon gets another composable. So within this parameter, we pass another composable, and we can put whatever we want in there. But in this case, of course, because it's a leading icon, it makes sense to put an icon in here. And the icon that we want to put in, which icon could that be? I'm thinking maybe we can use the material icons for this because we want to use the default search icon. We could also use another icon that we get from our resources, but in this case, the search icon is the one we want. Additionally, we also want to set a content description. And the content description in our case, we can set it to null because we will have a placeholder text, which will be enough to tell accessibility services what this text field is about.
Great. Now, the next step is the placeholder.
Yeah, so the placeholder behaves a bit like the leading icon. The placeholder itself also requests a composable, and inside that composable we can build, and in this case we will put a text in there. But again, if we want to put in something else, we could put in whatever composable we want. So that's the flexibility of using those kind of different parameters. So the text that we will put in, we will get it from our string resources, and we will use the placeholder search text for that.
Great. Last but not least, we need to adapt the background color of this composable. And we actually want to use the material surface color for this.
Yeah, so if we want to adapt the color of the text fields, we actually we can't just set one specific color. So it doesn't have a background color specified. Instead, it has a colors parameter, which receives text field colors. And what we can do is, instead of now having to pass all those different colors, we can use the text fields defaults and use the text field colors here. And this will have all the default values for all the different colors of the text fields in the material library set by default. And then we can just override that one that we need. So in our case, we want to override just the background color and set it to material themes, colors, and give it the surface color.
So with these adaptations, our search bar is supposed to look like the designs.
Yes,
let's take a look.
It is rendering right now. And I think once this renders, we will get a really nice... Yes, that's what we want. So going back to our design, if we take a look at what we had in our original design and now take a look at Android Studio, you can see that these now behave the same and they look the same. So with that, I think we can get on and go to our next element to implement.
So the next composable we want to implement is the align your body element. And in our designs, we can actually see a round image with some horizontally centered text beneath it. In the Redlines design, we can actually see that this image should be 88 dp. And this design actually contains so-called baseline spacings, where we show the distance between the baseline of the text and the top or the bottom. The baseline of a text is actually a line on which the text sits, so to say. In our design, the baseline of the text should be 24 dp distance to the image and 8 dp to the bottom of the element. In addition, this design also specifies that the text should be styled with material H3 type. So, Yolanda, how would you implement this design?
Well, I think at the highest level here, we have a column because we're laying out several children, an image and a text vertically. So we want to create a column with an image inside and with a text inside. So let's start with that very basic first implementation, and then we can iterate based on that. So we'll go back to Android Studio to the Align Your Body element composable. And in there, we will create a column. And in the column, we can pass along the modifier that we get. We can import our column. And inside the column, we want to put an image and we want to put a text. And now, of course, we have to give that some information. So in our case, our image wants to get a painter resource, which is our drawable. And for this case, we will use the AB1 inversions drawable. We will just hard code this for now, and we might change that later. And again, we want to give a content description. In this case, it's a decorative image because our text below will actually show what we're talking about. So we can just set that content description to null. And for the text, we can pass a string resource and we can use the AB1 inversions string here. So with this, we have a very basic, naive implementation. We didn't do any of the styling yet, but we do have the correct composables set up. So let's take a look at how that will turn out.
Great. So we do see an image and a text, but there are some improvements that we can make. The image is a bit too big and it's not round. The text isn't styled and isn't centered horizontally. And to make the image the correct size, we can actually use the modifier for the image and set it to 88 dp, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's what our design said. So
great.
Again, we can use a modifier like we did before with our search bar. And we can use the modifier to set a specific size. In this case, we don't have to work with minimum sizes because this image will always be 88 by 88. So we will set that explicitly to 88 dp, and with that, our image will be sized correctly. So what do we do next?
Great. The next thing we can do is to make it round. So we can actually use the clip modifier and set the shape to a circle shape.
Yes, let's use the clip here and the circle shape, as you said. And the clip will basically just cut off whatever shape you fill in here. So that can be like a rounded corner or a rectangle shape. But in this case, we use the circle shape, which will cut off in the form of a circle.
Now, to make the image fill the container correctly, we can actually set the image content scale parameter to crop.
Yes, so let's dive into that a little bit more. So we want to set the content scale parameter to be crop. And as you can see, there's different options here. So this is, as you can see in the current preview, you can see that the image is cut off in quite a weird way, right? So it's fitting inside its parent container, but we just made that parent container square. And somehow the X and Y aren't really scaling the right way. So if we use crop, we will basically tell the image to fill the X and the Y in such a way that the smallest one completely fills up the parent. And with that, we will get what we want. So there's different ways to do this, as I already said. And let's take a look at the code lab to see the different options. So the first one we saw was the fit, and that's the default for an image. But then you can also choose to fill bounds, which will stretch the image so that it fits both on the X and on the Y axis. And then we had the crop, which is the one we used, where we fit the smallest one and then cut off the other axis. So with this, I think our image is starting to look quite nice. But now I think we want to do a little bit more with the text, right?
Yeah, we can actually give our string some style. And per designs, we can actually use the typography H3 for that.
Okay, so we're styling this text according to the material theme, and we're using the third heading for that. And with that, our text will use the correct size and the correct font and the correct, etc.
Great. Like we mentioned before, we also want to add spacings based on the text baseline. And we can actually use the padding from baseline modifier for that.
Yeah, so since we're doing sizing here again, what we want to do is we want to use another modifier. And we've used the padding modifier before. You've seen it being passed to the search bar. But in this case, we want to work with a padding from a baseline. So as Simona explained at the beginning of this section, it is often when you work with text, you want to align based on the baseline of that text. And in our case, we want to use a top alignment of 24 dp, and we want to use a bottom alignment of 8 dp. And with that, we will have the alignments exactly the way they are in the design. So anything else?
Now, I think we can finally set the horizontal alignment to the parent column. In Compose, instead of aligning a child inside its parent, you can actually let the parent decide how to lay out its children. For a column, you can decide whether its children should align to the start, center, or the end. And for a row, that would be a top, center, or a bottom. So for a box, you can actually combine horizontal and vertical alignment, so both. You can also override the alignment of one specific child using the align modifier on that specific child. In our case, we want the text to be centered horizontally inside the column, so we'll set the column's horizontal alignment to center.
Yes, so let's do that and also nicely give our modifier a named parameter. And as you mentioned, it might have gone a little bit fast. We can also always override this for one of the children by using the align modifier. So you can always choose to have one child aligned to the start or the end and the rest to the center, for example. That's always a possibility, but in general, you can tell the column that every child should be laid out in the center horizontally. And that's what the alignments are used for. And with
Great.
that, I think we're basically there. We should have our whole align your body element implemented. Let's take a quick look. So let's zoom in a little bit. And let's take a quick look at our code lab to see if those are now aligned. Yes, they look exactly the same. Amazing.
Looks great.
So up to the next step.
Yep. So far, we've used a hard-coded image and text for our composable. And to make the composable actually reusable, we need to pass in dynamic values for it. So you can change them from outside of the composable. So let's add a parameter.
I forgot about that, Simona. That's not really nice of me. But indeed, we're working with these hard-coded values here. And that's not very flexible, is it? So we do want to pass these from the outside in, don't we?
Exactly. We can add a parameter for the image, and we can call it, for example, a drawable.
Yeah, and we can make it an int drawable resource, right? Well, then we can pass just a resource name, and we don't have to actually pass the full image inside this composable.
Yeah, exactly. And we can also add the text as one of the parameters.
Yeah, so let's forward that drawable so that it's being used as well by our image. And then let's add this string resource and call it, do we call it text?
Yeah, we can do.
And we will replace this one with this text resource. So this is not gonna build right now because we were creating a preview and calling our elements from the preview. So we will have to pass a hard-coded drawable and text there. In this case, we will use the same ones that we were using before. The r.string.ab inversions. And with that, nothing will actually change, which is why I thought we were already done. But we will now have a dynamic component, which is much better. So let's go back to our code lab. Are we done now?
Yeah. Our next stop is the favorite collection card composable. It's fairly similar to the previous align the body one. So let's take a quick look at the designs first. For this design, we can see that our full size is provided and that the text should be H3. We can also notice that its background color is different from the screen background. So how can we quickly achieve that? Well, we can use the material surface composable. Surface is a component in the Compose material library and follows general material design patterns. And you can adapt it by changing your app's theme. If you want to learn a bit more about this, check out the Theming and Compose Code Lab or the theming documentation. Yolanda, can you show us how to use Surface in our code?
Yes, so let's make sure that I understand you correctly. So we're creating this new composable, which will be a surface with some rounded corners, I see. And inside will be a row with an image and a text. Well, that row will be quite similar to what we did before, but let's take a look at that surface. So let's open up Android Studio and go to our favorite collection card and start implementing it here. So we'll start with this surface, and this will autocomplete to the surface that is part of Compose Material Library. And inside that surface, as I said, we want to create a row, and inside the row, we want to create an image again and a text again. So on the highest level, this is what we're creating. So let's do the imports that we need to do. Let's make sure that we, again, forward the modifier parameter. And inside our image, let's this time also fill it in with some hard-coded data. So in this case, our painter resource will be the drawable nature meditations, and the text will be the string resource r.string.fc to nature meditations. And again, our text will give us the right information for the for the accessibility services. So in our case, the only thing we need to do is pass a no content description here. And with that, we have a very basic implementation. And we can start to run this and see how it looks in the preview while we consider what else we might want to add to this.
First thing that kind of comes to mind instantly is the fact that we want the surface, like you said initially, to be with rounded corners. So for this specific parameter, we can actually use the shape parameter and pass the material theme shape small to add those rounded corners.
Yeah, so where before when we set the clip shape, we used a circle shape, which was a hard-coded shape basically. We can also choose to use the shapes that are provided by the material theme. So in this case, we can say that our surface has small rounded corners. And that basically, if you take a look at the implementation, you will see that by default, that is a rounded corner shape of 4 dp, which is exactly what our design tells us to use. So there we have the shape of our surface. And I think with that, we can also, well, if you look at the preview, do something about the size of that image, right?
Exactly. It's a bit too big now. So we can actually set the size of the image to 56 dp using the size modifier.
Yes, so let's use a fixed size here of 56 dp. And with that, our image should be much smaller, but again, it will probably be cropped off the right way, right? The image itself is using the wrong content scale. So we can change this again the same way we did before, and we can use the content scale crop instead of using the default, which is fit. And with that, our image is starting to look quite nice, but I think the text can use some work.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can also add the width of the entire row to limit it to 192 dp, which is what the design said.
That is true. Let's not forget about that one. So we wanted this width to be fixed size, in this case 192 dp. And with that, it will start to look a little bit bigger in our preview as well. There we go.
Great. One more thing we can actually do is we can use the vertical alignment of the row to center it vertically, similarly to what we did before in the previous step.
Yes, so instead of using the horizontal alignment, now we will use the vertical alignment, and we will use the center vertically option here. And then let's make sure we use a named parameter for our modifier. That way our text will now nicely start to align in the middle of the parent container. And what about the text itself?
Great. I think for the text, we can actually use the text style to H3, similarly like we did for our previous composable.
So we use the style and we set it to be material themes, typography H3, same as before. And we might want to add some padding there as well.
Exactly.
Right, so
we can add,
padding we would do with a modifier, if I'm not mistaken. So we can give this some horizontal padding. As you can see, there's like different ways that you can set padding. You could do it with specifically the start, top, end, and bottom, or you can give all of the sizes the same, or all of the sides the same padding. But in our case, we're using the horizontal or vertical one. And here we can see that by default, it will use 0 dp for both horizontal and vertical. So if we don't want to do something special, we can say for horizontal, we override it with 16 dp.
16 dp. Great. Now, the last step would be to actually make this composable dynamic as well. So we can pass the parameters same way we did previously. We can use
I won't forget about that anymore. So this is an int, and we will pass a string resource for the text. I'm already used to this. So there we go. We replace this one with the drawable. I'm making a typo here. There we go. And we replace this hard-coded string with the dynamic string. And then we will, of course, also need to adapt the preview to make sure that it passes the drawable as drawable dot nature meditations, and it passes the text as r.string dot nature meditations. There we go. And with that, our preview should look the same as before, but this time with dynamic data in it. So let's go back for a second to our code lab and take a look at our original design. So we had this card, which we implemented using a surface, which had some H3 text on it with some padding between the image and the text, and the image needed to be cut off correctly. And now if we look at our preview, we can see that that is actually what we're creating. This looks very close to our design. So I think that gives us the basic building blocks of our app. And with that, we should be able to continue to start combining those into a little bit more high-level components.
Yeah, exactly. Before we continue, we can actually do a bit of a recap of what we did so far. So if we go back to the original designs, we can actually see that we've implemented the search bar, the align your body element, and the favorite collection card. Now for the search bar, we use a text field and we learned about modifiers to change the size of the composable. While implementing the align your body element, we learned about alignment. And when implementing the favorite collections card, we learned about material surface. So what's next now?
So next up, I think we can implement the align your body row, which is the horizontally scrollable row. And with that horizontally scrollable row, we should be able to look at our design and try to see how we need to implement this. Well, what we can see is that basically at the core, this is just a horizontal container which contains all of our align your body elements. And I think if we look at the red lines design, there's two extra things that we can see. And that's that there's a little bit of spacing at the beginning and the end of our complete container. And then there's ATP in the middle. And of course, let's not forget, it is inside a scrollable container. So we will have to do something special there.
Yeah, exactly. Because we need a scrollable row to display a few items, and in a production environment, chances are that we'll have a lot of items to load up and display. So for this purpose, Compose offers lazy composables, such as lazy row and lazy column. And these layouts actually render only the elements that are shown on the screen instead of all elements at the same time. And this actually helps us keep our app performant. There's a lot more to do with lazy, so take a look at the full documentation if you're interested. How can we implement this, Yolanda?
Well, as you told me, I will have to be using a lazy row. So let's go to our align your body row composable and let's start to implement this. I think at the highest level, we will use a lazy row and then we will pass some data into it. So inside the lazy row, we will just forward again the modifier that we're passing into this composable. But then inside, we're not going to be calling our composables directly. Instead, we will be using the lazy list DSL, and that has methods such as item or items. And with those, we can actually emit only the elements that are shown at a certain moment on screen, which makes this a very strong way to deal with long lists of elements. So in our case, let's use items, and we will pass our dummy data that we shown at the beginning of this code lab. We will pass it in there. And for each of these elements in that list, we will call that an item. We can call our align your body row. And the align your body, we will call the align your body element. Yes, there we go. Not the row, because that will be a huge recursive thing, which will probably definitely break my computer. We're calling the align your body element, and we will pass in the drawable, which is going to be not an R drawable because that would be fixed, but instead we're going to get that from the item. So we can give the item drawable and the text can be the item text. So with that, basically what we're saying is we're using this data, and let's take a quick look at what that data is. So this is basically a quick map of hard-coded drawables to strings. And we will use that to create a composable for each one of them. And with that, I think we have a very basic implementation of our horizontal row. And as you can see, this is cut off now. And we can actually run it in interactive mode to see how the scrolling behaves and if it actually behaves. So inside, we can see that we can now scroll this container. So this interactive preview is really strong tool to see how your composable will behave on a device.
Yeah, I think we can actually see from that preview that also some spacings are missing around the items. And to actually implement these, we also need to learn a bit more about arrangements. Now, in a previous step, we talked about alignments, which are used to align the container's children on the cross-axis. So for a column, that cross-axis is actually the horizontal axis, while for row, it is a vertical one. However, we can also control how to place child composables on the container's main axis, horizontal for row and vertical for column. In our case, I think we just need to add some fixed spacings between the items. So we'll again use the arrangement space by with an 8dp and set it to horizontal arrangement. But it's really important to know what all of the options are with arrangements. So in our composable, let's pass a horizontal arrangement to our row.
Yes. So I'm going to quickly jump back into the CodeLab to show that there's like a lot of different options here. So when you have a parent container, there's a lot of different ways in which you can lay out its children. In our case, as you said, we will be using the spaced by method, which will just put a fixed space in between items. So let's use the horizontal arrangement, and we will be using arrangement spaced by, in our case, 8dp. And with that, we will be adding that spacing between the elements of our row. But now I think in our original design, we also saw that there was 16 dp of spacing all the way at the start of the container, and then there was 16 all the way at the end, wasn't there?
Yeah, exactly. So going back to what you mentioned before, we also need to add more padding for the first and the last element. And we need to have that incorporated when we actually scroll. And when we try to scroll, we want it to actually remain within the bounds of the parent container. So in that case, what we need to do is we need to take a look at one special parameter for our row, which is called content padding. And content padding actually lets us pass horizontal padding values, which we can set to 16 dp in our case. And this will actually help us maintain the same padding, but we can scroll the content within the bounds of the parent list without clipping it, which is the effect that we actually want to achieve.
Okay, that sounds really complex. So let's start by just trying out a normal padding and see how that behaves. Just want to make sure that we understand why this default padding wouldn't work. So if we render basically this lazy row and just set the padding, what's going to happen is that the lazy row itself will get that padding and not the content per se. And what that means for our preview is that, well, this looks correct at the beginning, but as you can see at the end, our content will actually be cut off. And now once we start scrolling at the beginning, our content will also be cut off. So this padding is not what we want, even though it might seem so when you first use it. So let's get rid of that padding and instead use this content padding variable that you mentioned so nicely. And with that content padding, we will see that the padding is really added inside the container and not on top of the container, so to say. So with this, once our preview renders, we can see that now there's a nice 16 dp at the start. Nothing is being cut off, but all the way at the end of our row, we also see the 16 dp. So with that, I think we have our align your body row completely done according to our design. We've added the spacing, we have added the spacing between the different items, and we have all the dynamic data in there. So let's return to our CodeLab and take a look at our next step, the favorite collections grid.
So let's take a look quickly at the designs for this. So this requires actually a new composable type, which is called a grid, and one that is actually scrollable horizontally. So for this case, we can use the lazy horizontal grid, which is part of the lazy layouts API we previously mentioned, and it was released in Jetpack Compose 1.2. So we'll need to use at least this version to be able to use grids. Adding a grid is fairly simple. So Yolanda, can you show us how to do that?
Yes, let's start by going to Android Studio and going to our favorite collections grid. And inside, as we said, we want to use the lazy horizontal grid, which is part of the lazy library of Compose. And inside, we want to pass a value for rows, and we want to pass the content. And for the content, we can use a trailing lambda again. So for the rows, how we pass that? Let's say, I think we want to define that we want to use grid cells, and we want to use either adaptive or fixed grid cells. Well, in our case, this grid always needs to have two rows, so it needs to be 2 cells high, so to say. So we can use the fixed one and set it to 2. And this is just telling the lazy horizontal grid that it always needs to use 2 elements on top of each other. And for the content, as we said, we can use the trailing lambda, and we would have the same situation as we had before with the lazy row. We can just pass items, or we can call items to emit our different composables. And inside our items, in this case, we will use the hard-coded favorite collections data. And that will pass us an item. And we will have to import this items method. And then inside we can call our favorite collection card. And we can pass the item drawable. We can pass the item text. There we go. So with this, we have a naive implementation.
Okay.
I did not forward the modifier yet, so I'll do that while you figure out what else we need to change about this composable.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at the preview to verify.
There we go. Oof. That's
Okay.
not too pretty, is it?
So, yeah, it seems the grid actually takes up as much space as the parent, which means that our collection cards are actually stretched way too much. So let's change this so that the grid cells actually have the correct size and spacing between them. There's a few things we can do here. First, let's set the height of our grid to 120 dp using the height modifier.
Yes. There we go.
Great. Now let's add spacings between all items. In our case, we will actually use horizontal and vertical arrangements both because of how grid works. And we can use the arrangement spaced by with 8 dp.
Yes, so let's use the horizontal arrangement spaced by. And I think we can do the same, but for the vertical arrangements. There we go. And with that, our grid cells will be spaced by 8 dp.
Great. Now we can actually add the padding values to the content padding, same like before, and set them to 16 dp horizontally.
Yeah, so again, we want to use that same kind of content padding. I'm going to just add it first, and then I'm going to show, based on the original design, why this is what we want. So I'm going to quickly go back to the code lab. And as you could see in the design, it also had the 16 dp at the start, the 16 dp at the end, and 8 dp between each cell. So with that, I think we have a preview that looks like our design, and we have this step done, right? That went quite fast.
Great. Let's move on to the next one then.
There we go. So if we go back to our designs, we can see that we have now implemented the 2 horizontally scrolling elements on our screen. We've implemented the align your body part, and we've implemented the favorite collections part. But when we look at the home screen of MySooth, we can see that we're actually using multiple sections that look quite similar. In this case, 2, but there might be more to come later when we add more features to the app. And we want to create something that will make us be able to reuse these kind of sections. And they have some patterns that are the same. So as you can see, each of the sections has a title, which has some baseline padding again. So the padding from the baseline is 40 dp to the top and then 8 dp to the bottom. And then the same goes for the favorite collection section here. So there's a title, but then in addition to the title, we also want to add a slot. And that slot will be able to contain completely different content, right? So in one case, it might have the align your body content, in the other, the favorite collections, or we might conceive of a completely different section which has different content. And that's, if we want to fill something in dynamically this way, we have to use something called the slot API. And maybe Simona, you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So to implement this reusable and flexible section, we will use the so-called slot APIs that you mentioned, and we want to use them to create a slot-based layout. In general, slot-based layouts leave empty spaces in their UI for the developer to fill in as they wish. We've seen them in the previous step when we actually implemented the search bar. The leading icon and the text parameter of that search bar were slots that we filled out with our icon and text composables. In our current case, we can create the slot for the content of the section.
Okay, so let's give that a go. So let's go to Android Studio and implement our home section. And we are currently only passing in the modifier, but as we said, this section will need a title as well. And the title in our case can be a string resource. because we will always need to add a title like this. And then in addition, we can add the content. And the content will be any composable, and then it will be up to the caller of this method to decide what that composable would be. So to do that, we can specify that this needs to be an addComposable method that gets nothing and then returns a unit. This is like the canonical way to define a composable in such a parameter definition. Okay, so with that, we have the input for our composable, and then let's lay that out. So we want to show the title first, and then underneath that, we want to show the content. So we could use a column, and we will forward our modifier. And inside the column, we will create a text which shows the title, and then we will create the content. With that, well, we do have to pass, of course, the title not as a string resource directly, but we have to call the string resource method here in order to make sure that it resolves as a string. So with that, I think we have a basic implementation of such a section, but this is not gonna build. And as you can see, my build fails because my preview isn't actually passing any information here. So in our preview, let's preview the align your body version. So for that, let's set the title to be r.string align your body, and let's pass that content. And because this is the last parameter of our method, we can use a trailing lambda to do that. And this is actually done a lot in Compose, and this is where all those trailing lambdas come from. And inside, we can pass whatever composable we want. In our case, we will be passing the align your body row. We don't have to pass any modifiers to that. That will just work as is. And with that preview, the preview should show the way we want it to. And we can take a look at if there's anything else that we need to define for our home section.
Great. So what we're still missing from the designs are some spacings and some styling of the initial text. So let's fix that. First, our text needs to have styling, which is set to be H2 heading from the material theme. It also needs to be in uppercase.
Wait, let's double check. Oh, yes, that's where it's from. I was double checking in the design where you got those messages from. Okay, so it needs to be H2 and uppercase. Let's start with that. So I will give it a style, and that will be the material theme dot typography and H2 this time. And then you also mentioned you wanted it to be uppercase, right? Like all caps. How would we do that? Would we do it in here maybe with the string itself?
Yeah, so we can actually use exactly the uppercase method.
Uppercase method, yeah. And we pass a default, which is always a nice thing to do because you never know what locale the user is using. So there we go. Great. And with that, at least our text will look correctly, but it's probably not spaced correctly yet, right?
Exactly, yeah. We can use the modifier to the text to give it the right padding. Vertically, it needs to be 40 dp to the top and then 8 dp to the bottom.
And again, because this is a text, we're padding from the baseline, right? So in this case, our top needs to be 40 dp and our bottom needs to be 8 dp. There we go.
Great. And we can also set some horizontal padding to the same modifier of 16 dp.
Okay, so this is interesting. We're now setting padding 2 times, right? So are we sure this isn't going to somehow influence each other? Maybe...
If we take a look and add the padding as a horizontal one, it will just space it out.
Yes. So here I'm adding all of them, but if we say that we want to use a horizontal padding here, then this padding modifier will basically only be applied horizontally, and then this one will be applied vertically because you have the top and the bottom. So these basically, while chaining these modifiers, they will kind of add up, right? Like one of them does the horizontal part, the other one does the vertical part. So they will both just pick that piece that they want to change. Great. So with that, I think we're spacing it correctly. Let's take a look at how our preview turns out. So there's a lot of space to the top. There's a little bit of space between the content and the title. And in our case, our preview renders the align your body, but we can always call this same home section with a different title and different content, and that will give us a different section.
Great.
So with that, I think we have our sections down, which means that we can probably start combining this into a complete home screen.
Yeah, we can move on to the home screen next then. So now that we've created the separate building blocks, like you mentioned, we can combine them into a full screen implementation. As our designs are showing, we need to place the search bar, then the Align Your Body section, then the favorite collection section. Can you show us how this is done, Yolanda, please?
Yes. So let's go back to Android Studio. And I think, again, we're going to be playing around with a column because we're placing things below each other vertically. So let's start with a column and we will pass on the modifier, and the inside, you can see that we are repeating something over and over again, right? But that's what we said at the beginning of the code lab. Like in the end, every design is built out of composables, and we adapt them using parameters, and we adapt them using modifiers. And so you see that same pattern happening over and over and over again. And once you get used to it, you get the hang of it, you start to become very fluent in this way of writing and implementing your designs. And you can actually implement your designs quite fast. So in this case, we have a column and we put in our search bar. We put in a home section, which we will call r.string.alignYourBody, which has as a content the Align Your Body row. And then we have another home section, and that home section will have the, not the Align Your Body, but the favorite collections title. And it will have the favorite collections grid as the input, or as the content, as the slot. So with that, we have the three of them showing below each other. And I think there's a couple of spacings that we might be missing in this case. So if we go back to our design, we can see that there's 16 dp there at the top of our column, and then probably also at the bottom. And then our search bar also has this 16 dp. But as we saw that while we were implementing the section, because we had that horizontal scrollable row and horizontally scrollable grid, we already added those 16 dp paddings there. So in our case, we only need to add them to the search bar and to our top level column. So I think for our column, we could use a vertical spacing. And then for our search bar, we can forward into the search bar the horizontal spacing. And with that, let's take a look at what our preview will look like. So this was before adding any spacings. And now with the updated version, adding that horizontal and that vertical padding, we should see something that looks a lot like our design. And again, we can open it. Oh, no, that's the animation inspection, which by the way is also really cool. But let's open it in, because this is not an animation code lab. Let's open it in the interactive preview instead and take a look at if this actually behaves the way we want. So we have a horizontally scrolling row here, and we have a horizontally scrolling grid, and both of these look really amazing. So with that, we have the basic setup. What else do we want to do with this?
I think to make sure that our design behaves well on all screen sizes, we can actually see if it's scrollable vertically in the case that our device maybe isn't high enough, maybe in landscape mode. And this requires us to add actual scrolling behavior. So as we've seen previously, lazy layouts such as lazy row and lazy horizontal grid actually automatically add the scrolling behavior for you, but you don't really always need a lazy layout. In general, you can use them when you have a lot of elements in the list or you expect large data sets to load. So emitting all items at once would come at a performance cost and you would slow down your app. When a list only has a fixed or a limited number of elements, we can instead choose to use a regular column or a row like we did now. But in that case, we need to add the scrolling behavior manually. So to do so, we can actually pass the vertical scroll or horizontal scroll modifiers. Can you show us how to do that for our code?
Yes, so let's take a look at where we would be adding that vertical scroll. So we already had a padding for our column, but as you said, we can explicitly tell that column that it needs to be scrollable vertically. And we can use the vertical scroll modifier for that. And with that, we need to pass something called the scroll state. Now, again, if you need to know more about how state works, I would kind of gently point you to the State in Compose workshop. And instead for this one, we will just say that we will be using the remember scroll state. And with that, this will be scrollable vertically, but we're not going to see that in our preview though. So let's change our preview up a little bit and let's add a height to it. So let's set the height to 180 and see how this behaves. So we're going to refresh our preview and see if we can actually make it scroll vertically. So we will have to use the interactive preview for that again. And let's see if this one picks it up. Yeah, there we go. So there's our screen content preview. And if we start the interactive modes, we can see that this is now scrollable vertically. However, I do see that we have some cutoffs here. See, so I think we might have made a little mistake with the padding of our column. So let's try to get that fixed. So let's go back to our home screen and our column. Yeah, we were setting a hard-coded padding. So instead, would we be able to use a content padding here? We can't. Okay, so this is interesting. So how would we then actually make sure that that padding shows up correctly? Because now we're cutting off things. What I am thinking is maybe the easiest way to solve this would be to add specific spacers. So we haven't touched upon spacers yet, but as you can see, a spacer basically only gets a modifier, and that modifier you give a specific height. And this will just create like kind of an empty composable, which doesn't really do much except for taking up space, which is why it's called a spacer. And if we add a spacer at the top and at the bottom of our column, then that's going to be inside of our column. So it's not specifically padding that's set on the column. Instead, it is a actual composable that is inside of our column. And if we add it like that, then I am going to assume that our preview will now correctly not cut off any of its content. So with that, I think we have our home screen completely finished, and we can move on to add the bottom navigation. So let's go back to our code lab and let's go to the next step, the bottom navigation.
Good news is we don't have to implement this entire composable from scratch by ourselves. Instead, we can use the bottom navigation composable that's part of the Compose Material library. This library contains a whole set of ready-made composables that help you create an app following the material design system. So let's implement this, Yolanda.
Yeah, let's go to Android Studio and let's implement our Soothe bottom navigation. And as Simona mentioned, we can use the bottom navigation composable here, which is coming from the material library. And inside the bottom navigation, we will pass on our modifier again. And inside our bottom navigation, we could put whatever composables we want, but specifically for our bottom navigation, to help us style it correctly, we can use bottom navigation items. And we will have to tell whether they're selected. So again, we're going to hard code that state here for now. We don't have time to implement the state here. And we have to do an on-click callback, which I will also just leave empty for now. And then next to that, there is a icon that we can set. And and there is a label that we can set. And let me just quickly put this all on one big line, because otherwise this is going to be unreadable for all of us. So we want to implement an icon and a label, and we want to build two of those bottom navigation items. So the first one will have an icon, which again is inside a composable. So we see that slot API in work again. And the icon will have one of the default icons from our material set. In this case, it will be the spa icon. And next to that, it will have a content description, which can be null because we will have the label next to it, and the label will describe what this is. So in our case, the label is a text, and it will use the string resource r.string bottom navigation home. And with that, we have a very basic implementation of one of our bottom navigation items. I'm just going to put them all a little bit on separate lines so they're a little bit more clear to see. And then I can just copy paste that whole bottom navigation item and create a second one. Normally, if you would have 4 or 5 of them, you would probably do this with like some state, and then that state would have the selected state, etc. But here we're just hard coding this for now. And in here, we would use the account circle image. And as the string resource, we would use the profile one. So this is a basic bottom navigation. And in our preview, we can see how that default one will turn out. There we go.
Yeah, so the bottom navigation does have the wrong color, but we can actually change this by specifying the background color of the parent bottom navigation composable and use the material theme colors background for it. This will actually make our composable match the designs.
Okay, let's take a look.
Exactly.
So we're going to set the background color. So in this case, the background color is actually a separate property. And if we set that, we can use the material theme background color to match it with the rest of our app.
Great. So for this final step, we will actually create the full screen implementation, including the bottom navigation. And to do this, we'll use the scaffold composable from the Compose material library. Now, scaffold gives you a top-level configurable composable that contains slot for other various material elements, like, for example, the bottom bar. And in this bottom bar, we can actually place the bottom navigation we just created in our previous step.
Okay, let's do that. So let's go to our MySooth app, the last one, but not the least one, of course. And let's call a scaffold here. Inside our scaffolds, we can put that bottom bar that you mentioned and then the content of our screen. So in this case, our bottom bar will be a composable, and the composable that we're going to be calling is our Sooth bottom navigation. And then inside, we actually get some padding values here, and then we call our home screen. Okay, with that and with our new preview that is now rendering, we should have exactly the design that we started with in the first place. Let's give it a second to load. There we go. And the whole app is now showing, including our bottom navigation. Let's zoom out a little bit. And we just in an hour completed this full design. Look at that.
Great. Congratulations! While implementing a real-world design, we've learned about modifiers, alignments, arrangements, lazy layouts, slot APIs, scrolling, and material components. You can use this knowledge now to quickly implement some of your own designs with Compose.
And if you want to continue your learning journey, make sure to check out the other Compose workshops and talks. Thanks for following along, and we can't wait to see what designs you implement with Jetpack Compose.